I got it. What do? I run a website, which is for jobs. We do training, we do all sorts of bits and pieces. Also run the Beak to Art Technician Union with Phil, who is joining us, who's also, we do most of the training that we do is us two together. This is pretty exciting for me because this is the last session in all of this project that we've been doing, so that's quite nice, but it's pretty exciting stuff. So risk assessments, method statements, and install guides is what we're going to be looking at today. Please feel free to just ask questions in the middle of this. Stop me if you want me to stop and ask questions, and we can address stuff at the time, or I can say we're going to be addressing that later on. But this session is for you guys to get as much as possible as you can from this. So it's great if you want to engage, ask questions, but otherwise I'm going to show you a load of stuff. So let's crack on. I'm going to share my screen. Colette, host.
Sorry, I will facilitate sharing. I forgot
okay.
to do that. And I also forgot to mention that closed captions are available should anyone wish to use them. In the lower panel on Zoom, you can click to allow closed captions. Okay.
And Phil and Colette, feel free to jump in with any comments as we're going. So sharing screen, just be 1 second. Okay, let me get rid of all of you. So we're looking at risk assessments, method statements, and installation guides. There we go. So the aim of this session is to examine and give an understanding of risk assessments, which are often referred to as RAMS, method statements and installation guides for the safe handling of art and artifacts. So just briefly run through the 3 different types and what they actually are. They all often feed into each other, and we'll discuss when they're generally required and things like that. But just a bit of a summation of each. So a risk assessment is the process of identifying what hazards currently exist or may appear in the workplace and culminates in a written document. A risk assessment defines which workplace hazards are likely to cause harm to employees and visitors, steps which can be taken to mitigate those risks. It is a legal document which is based in health and safety law. You should have one for any work you undertake, whether created by yourself or your workplace. A method statement is a written documentation of the method in which a program of work is undertaken, which can cover lots of different things. So transport, route planning, installation and packaging, essentially anything around kind of the art technical work that needs to be done around an artwork, which feeds back into the risk assessment. They are generally used for complex work and used most often in public institutions as part of their health and safety requirements. An installation guide is the written documentation of how to install an artwork or object in line with an artist, studio, lender's requirements. I spelled lenders wrong, whoopsie. Okay, so we'll start with risk assessments, or RAMS, first. So not a lot of people know, but employers are required by law to protect their employees and others from harm. So under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, the minimum you must do is identify, the minimum an employer must do is identify what could cause injury or illness in their business, so hazards, decide how likely it is that someone could be harmed and how seriously, which is the risk, and take action to eliminate the hazard, or if this isn't possible, control the risk. So assessing risk is just one part of the overall process used to control risks in your workplace. UK law states that a risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient, i.e. it should show that A, a proper check was made, you dealt with the obvious significant risks and taking into account the number of people who could be involved. The precautions are reasonable and the remaining risk is low. So if you turn up on a job and say you're there for an install or you're unloading trucks or something like that, an organization that you're working for has to, by law, actually have risk assessments for any work that is undertaken in that workplace. They legally also have to provide it for you if you ask for it. And some places are pretty good that when you rock up for a show change, they'll have the RAMS on the wall for you to have a look at, or often they'll send it around to you prior to your work taking place. And it's a really good idea just to familiarize yourself with it. Essentially, what it is that it's covering, it's so workplaces cover their bums, essentially, that everything's been looked at and they're trying to keep you as safe as possible so they don't then get in trouble legally. It's not always your employer, though. I quite often will have to complete risk assessments for jobs that I'm running as a manager. And even though I'm freelance, that I often have to prepare them for stuff. But if you're asked to do one within a workplace and you're actually hired by that workplace as a contracted part-time, full-time staff member, then by law, you're actually supposed to have done proper training in risk assessments and how to complete them. And it has to be how do you, it's OSHA, I always forget how you're supposed to pronounce it, by IOSH approved, which means the Health and Safety at Work organization. And this is a scale below. The scale below is essentially how we assign the level of severity and the likelihood of risk happening. So what you do is you look at the risks that you've got, you'll note them down. I'll show you in a second a risk assessment and go through it. But essentially you have level of severity. So 5 is severe to 1, which is insignificant. And then you compare that with the likelihood or the probability of the action potentially happening and essentially work it out on this scale. Now they say anything that's in a red or a black is work that shouldn't take place if you can't actually mitigate some of the risks involved. Yellow and green are acceptable. So this is an example of a risk assessment. This was actually for the core training that we did not last week, the week before. And essentially it is treated like a legal document sometimes. So it's one of those things that you need to have some basic information, like the date that it was created and who did the assessment. So it was me for and on behalf of ArtTechSpace, my company, and then the project. So it was art technician core training with CVAN, and the location. That is so they can also trace back where the work's happening, because it might not always be on site and things like that. Because essentially for any work that take place in an organization, they need to have everything documented for all locations of work happening. And then it's the dates, the start date and end date of when these activities will be happening on this site for this project. And then so you move through tasks. So here we've got the first example is movement of equipment in and around building. So I've identified the task, and the hazard that can potentially happen through doing that is that people can undergo physical injury. And who on site will be at risk, so the people. And here it was all people on site. So that's the people undertaking the training, the staff there, the visitors to the castle. And then we'd looked at the scale and said, okay, the severity is potentially a 4, and the likelihood of it happening is a 2. So that's going back to this here. So 4 and a 2, or 4 and 2, whatever. Oopsie, sorry about that. Oh, sorry. There we go. Then you have to list down what measures are taken to actually try and stop any physical injury, the hazard, whilst doing the task of moving equipment in and around the building. So all equipment to be moved by appropriate number of persons, heavy items to be moved on wheels where possible, a suitable number of persons to be used to move large heavy items. Learners will only do so after appropriate demonstration and direction has been given by facilitators. Then you can also, because that's what it was in place already, but we added additional controls, which was all trainees and facilitators to be familiar with the building and actively practice route planning prior to all movements. And then once we've put these controls in place, then we can reduce the risk. So then you have new risk, whoopsie, oh. And then essentially here it's you accept or reject. Now, often I work for the NHS quite a lot, and I'll have to send these RAMS to them for specific projects that I do. And they can just go through and actually say, oh, we actually accept or reject that. If it's rejected, then we need to go back to the drawing board and go, well, is that something that we can feasibly do on site? And what other measures can we put in place? Essentially, put additional controls in place. And here you've got 2, which is lifting of heavy objects. But this is the pretty, whoops, oh my goodness, sorry. The big documents. This is page 1 of a 3-page document. So when you see here where it's a red, that would be that the risk factor is incredibly high. Essentially, the lower you don't go down in the color, the less likely, the less dangerous the risk is. So here, the lifting of heavy objects is seen as a really high risk factor because it was, straining themselves from lifting heavy objects in particular. And then the measures put in place and we can reduce it down to a 3. Excuse me, sorry. Things like you need to say if you're going to use electrical items. So here we were, and it was agreed with the Nottingham Castle that it was only facilitators that would be dealing with that. But essentially we need to make sure that we're conforming with legal things like BS 7909, which I have had to read and is really, really boring, but essentially that we're conforming to actual laws around these things, and things like current PAT testing for electrical equipment. So that was actually distributing power. That's not the use of electrical equipment, which would be things like drills and stuff like that. Oh, sorry, no, that's TVs. Sorry, it's been I hadn't looked at this properly this morning. And then you've got use of powered tools, you've got use of steps and ladders, manual handling of items, and lots of other things. And essentially then you can go back to, this is the last page of it, that because it is a legal document, it needs to be signed. So it's got my signature there, but also always there's lots of different essentially bars or graphs, I suppose you could say, like this. Keys actually is the best word for that. A key to risk assessments. There's a couple of different ones that are online. This is the standard one I've always used, but there are others out there. This was one that I used since I did my proper risk assessment training, which is a very, very exciting 2-day course. It's not. Any questions about risk assessments?
Hi, Sarah. Just to say, I guess, in terms of the legal requirement and who is carrying out risk assessments, etc. I guess for individuals who might be working in organisations that aren't publicly funded, aren't necessarily charities or in meanwhile space, etc. In terms of carrying out risk assessments and gaining more support on putting together and putting in place risk assessments? What would your advice be around this?
Well, they have to, if no matter what type of organization you are, you have to have risk assessments by law. A lot of people don't know that, and only find out when something goes wrong, because what happens is when an accident happens, then it has to be reported, especially if it is generally serious, it will be reported. And then what happens is IOSH come into your workplace and they will want to see the risk assessments that you have in place and what measures you've taken to try and stop any sort of accidents like that happening. So it's something to make sure essentially you cover your bum as an organization. But you really do need training on this, and you shouldn't really be expected to do a risk assessment unless you've had proper training. Because there's a lot to cover, and you, again, because it essentially becomes a legal document, it needs to be really thorough and really comprehensive. I didn't know that it was a legal requirement until about 12 years into my career, and is generally in most countries, to be honest, you normally have to have some sort of risk assessment in place for any work that's happening. And that doesn't matter if it's even technical work, just having public, the public in a space, say, if a small gallery, you need to have those like risk assessments in place. If you have anything where anyone is coming into a space to do anything, pretty much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
There's a related question that's come to me, which is, who is the risk owner if you are working with multiple parties who are putting the RAMS together?
Well, it is the responsibility of whoever is managing the site. So that can be the or the job sometimes as well. Whoever is the top that you are reporting to is generally the person that should be responsible for creating the risk assessments. Yeah,
and again, that's something that might be outlined in, say, a partnership agreement, which isn't something that a technician would necessarily need to have access to, or would typically have access to. But if, say, two organizations are working in partnership to deliver a project in a space, and it's a kind of a conversation around who takes that responsibility, it might be included within a partnership agreement.
Yeah, it might be. Really, whoever is undertaking the work, there needs to be at least one person undertaking the work that has done the risk assessments generally. If we're talking about actual technical work, that is. And then the liability is with the employer or the person managing the work. And generally will come back to whoever did the RAMS. But if you are found to have not, if you have actively seen risk assessments for any work you're doing and injury happens to you, and you weren't actually following what had been outlined in the risk assessment, then unfortunately you are liable for the injury, and it's not your employer's problem. That's why it's really important as technicians to actually have a look at these documents and see them before you start work, because it's then kind of up to you to make sure that employer upholds the health and safety, that they are actually, because I've worked places where they've had the risk assessments all there and it was really, really great, really comprehensive, but then they were asking me to essentially ignore what had been outlined in the risk assessment of how I installed something and handled something. And so it was then unfortunately on me to say, look, I'm really not comfortable doing that. That's a risk to my health and safety. It's not in your RAMS, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And then that becomes a whole other conversation. But also if you have an employer who actively disregards their risk assessments, they don't they aren't able to provide you with risk assessments within, I think it's you've got to give them a reasonable time frame. I think it's like a day or two. I can't remember now. I'd have to look that up. But if they don't do that, you can actually report them to IOSH. And you can do that anonymously as well. I know a couple of people that have done that. And they have been able to remain anonymous. It's really difficult when you're the only technician there, though. They're going to obviously know then that you've got an issue, but it's one of those things that you really need to cover yourself, because the employer's trying to cover them, but you need to cover yourself as well and be aware of the potential risks.
Great.
In your workplace. But yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, great. Let's move back to the presentation.
Okie dokie. Method statements. Way.
Please feel free to keep questions coming through, everyone.
So method statements. So a method statement is used alongside a risk assessment to ensure certain high-risk tasks and activities involved in a project are safe. So method statements are documents that detail exactly how to carry out work safely. A good method statement for each task should include more detailed planning than the risk assessment can go into. So essentially it's taking what you should further break down each task identified within the risk assessment into steps. While the risk assessment is used to assess the hazards involved in each step, the method statement should describe all the precautions and safety protocols to mitigate risks. A method statement will also include more general information, such as how many hours to spend on each task, the sequence of planned work, management and responsibilities, and emergency procedures. So this is one that you can get online. This is actually used in the building trade a lot more, but it's quite a good example of essentially what you need to look for and detail in a method statement. So again, you're documenting at the top here what the project is. Often you might need a reference number, because quite often method statements have to go to health and safety within large organizations and sit alongside your risk assessments. Your name, the contractor potentially, because sometimes it might be that you've got to do a method statement on behalf of a contractor, because there's lots of cogs in the wheel. Generally, when it's a specialist discipline, this is when you could put things like what's the type of work that's being done, but generally we don't tend to do that so much. But and then this, I'm not going to go into that so much, but you definitely need the assessed by. So that would be, say, if I was doing it, that would be my name and the date that I've done this method statement. Then you go through essentially like, so task, process, and the area of specialization. So you detail then exactly what the task is and what special skills essentially people would need. The tasks and in terms of the actual sequence of how they're going to be delivered, who's a supervisor, how many, when you're looking at how many people, things like that, but who's the chain of command, who do you need to go back to when on site if there are issues or there needs to be changes to the method statement. Monitoring, who essentially is going to be checking that the method statements is actually being followed, because on some sites they will have a health and safety team, or they will have a designated member of an art technical team that will actually have to make sure that the method statement is being followed, and if it's not, to actually go back and change it. Because again, it's used as a legal document a lot of the time, especially for very large organizations, to make sure that everything is done in the correct way, health and safety wise, for those working on it and around it. So plant, sorry. So plant, when they say plant in lots of these documents, it means like the equipment that's needed. And quite often with big things, like you might be hiring in equipment or plant, And so it's about actually detailing what is needed. Reference to occupational health standards, I've never had to do that. But oh no, I did actually. You do sometimes, in terms of if you're working with chemicals and things like that on site, you'd need to actually put down what occupational health standard you'll be following, which should be from your RAMS. It should be in there. Who will be the first aider on site, and also what first aid equipment you'll have on site. What you need in terms of PPE, personal protection equipment. So do you need gloves? When are they supposed to be used? Things like that. We don't do the next one, number 9. That's not done so much, number 10. And emergency procedures, though, is one that, sorry, my thing's being very sensitive. Emergency procedures. So in the event of emergency, like a fire evacuation, or if something goes really wrong on site, who do you contact, and what is the procedure you want them to go through? So this is an example of a method statement I did last year when working at Frieze, London, the art fair. And so this is what I had to prepare and submit to the Frieze health and safety team before they would let us go ahead and do any work. So they needed to have, alongside my RAMS, an actual statement of exactly what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. So as you can see here, it's I've put a note of it was me that prepared it, and on this date. Also, all my contact details, because you don't know who you're going to be dealing with. And sometimes people will walk around and be like, how do I get hold of you? Or they don't, you might never have spoken to this person, but they've been given your method statement and they want to phone you on site, things like that. You should always be contactable if you're the lead person on an install, especially in a very busy public, well, it wasn't public at the time, but an incredibly busy site. Then you detail the dates, the project. So this was it, so they can always refer back to it, because they'll also be probably looking at lots of different things and they need to know exactly which space this is in and who the project is actually for. And then the dates, so the installation, the date, and that was the start time, and then the deinstallation, and that was the start time. There was no end time put because we didn't know how long it was going to take. And then detailing exactly what the work location was, and often you will need to put maps and things like that in, or you'll need to put plans of an actual space. Here I had to put one of the corridor, which is where we were working. Then detailed the equipment required. So a genie lift, scissor lift with a working height of 3 meters. And I'd been told that Frieze was supplying that. So again, you note things like that. We needed safety barriers around our working space, and Frieze said they'd be supplying, but it was to be confirmed. Otherwise, I was going to supply some hazard ribbon. We needed a ladder, power drills, and then we had these poles, which were how we suspended the artwork, because it was a big long silk. This is it here. Big long thing that we had to put together with poles, galvanized steel poles across the corridor overhead of people. So this is also why it was quite extreme. Like, you don't always have to do method statements quite this detailed, but because it was going to be a public space when the fair was open, we had to make sure that these poles that were very long, they were 4 meters long, that they weren't going to fall down and hit someone on the head. So essentially it was making sure that everybody knew what was happening. So that's why I also added in the link to the actual poles, so they could check online to have a look if they wanted to check it. Again, we needed the 30 flanges, which would hold up the poles, and again added the link for them. we'd have a laser measure, laser level and measure, screws, and plasterboard plugs, roll plugs. So essentially I'm detailing everything that we're going to use in that space, so they're completely prepared for everything and they're not going to get a shock that we're turning up with stuff. And also it was a way of them making sure they were prepared, so like with the scissor lift and also the safety barriers, which they were. Then you detail what the nature of the work is. So you've got to be quite explicit in this. So I'll go through it, read through it. So art technician Sarah Titheridge will lead the installation of the artwork with one other art technician. At the time, the name of that person was TBC, and will attend the site on Saturday, 8th of the 10th. What? Whoopsie. Oh, whoops. It was the 8th to the 10th and of 9th of October of 2020. Whoopsie, mucked that up. No one ever said anything, but never mind. From 10 a.m. for the installation of the poles which support the artwork. They will sign in with on-site security to gain access and wear security passes, high visibility vests, and steel-toe footwear at all times whilst on site. All tools and equipment will be moved into the corridor space via doors which access the vehicle entrances and will be kept tidy and compact as possible to avoid trip hazards in accordance with our RAMS. Exact doorways TBC on the day. They will access the work's location and undertake the installation of the artwork as instructed in accordance with the agreed method below. And this was to give them an idea of what we were doing. This is what the artist provided me with. And so just popping that in, because sometimes that's just much easier for people to understand. If you've got photographs, if you've got plans, essentially add that all in so everyone has as much information as possible and you're all on the same page. Then we had galvanized poles, which will span the width of the corridor and will be secured with the flanges. And then we'll drape the canopy of silk over the top, and that it would be, the drapage wouldn't sit more than 2.5 meters from the floor upwards. Doing method statements is actually a really great way to work through your process of working, especially if you're running something. It helps you really work through the idea of what you need, when you need it, and how you're going to do it, all the equipment you need, the amount of people, things like that. It's really useful. They are quite time consuming, but they're really helpful. Then it goes on to the installation plan. So space measured and pole positioning agreed. The space will be measured and the start and finish points of the pole positioning will be decided in discussion with the artist. Flanges added on one side of the corridor, it goes through that, then the poles installed, and then you install the fabric artwork. Now that was all really good, that it was detailed in that way, but in the end what happened was we actually had to change the method statement and our way of working, because it turned out the artist, although I'd sent them this information and I discussed it with them a couple of times of how I wanted to, essentially this process of working that I have detailed in this document, that it turned out they wanted to do it slightly differently. But again, what we did was we talked to the site manager and just said, look, we're going to have to modify the method statement. This is how we're going to do it, talk through the process. They were happy with us just talking about it. But sometimes they want you to go back and actually amend this document. But they didn't in this case, because they'd done lots of naughty things to mess it up, to be honest. This is another method statement, which is a gallery in London, which it requires every artwork to have one of these. And essentially it was quite a complex work where it needed, it was essentially, we were dealing with an artist and some other people, that their studio people that were involved, and they were struggling to understand how we would install it. And so I sat down with them and wrote up this document, which was actually, they have to have them, as I said, for every artwork that's installed, because then it's given to their health and safety team to sign off. And also their health and safety team will then come in at times and check that you're actually working to your method statements. That doesn't happen a lot of places. This is only the second place I've worked that they've ever done that, where a health and safety officer has come in to check. Normally it'll be technicians or technical managers or a curator or something that will come in and just say, how's it going? Are you still working to your methods of install, all that sort of stuff, and check in. But again, this is just this one, how they did theirs was you would have the artist name, the name of the work and the date, so you know that you're looking at a specific artwork, and then the actual medium of the work. So it was a site-specific installation, including ceramic sculpture, ready-made furniture and furnishings, and the dimensions themselves were variable. So the artwork was comprised of 5 domestic scenes covered in ceramics. It goes into a lot more detail, this document of it. I'm only going to show you a little bit because, as you can see, it was 9 pages. But this is just going to give you kind of a taster of a specific artwork, which often I have worked some places where the method statement will travel with an artwork. It's generally more likely going to be an install guide, which we'll look at in a minute, because this is normally a method statement for the organization. But sometimes they do travel with them, or are shared with lenders or purchasers or whoever, just because you've got all the information you really need that you will have in an install guide, but just a little bit more often. They liked to specify what the weight was of the work, and this was TBC because we didn't actually know exactly what the work was going to end up being. We had some idea of some of the stuff, but we didn't really know. So you've just got to be clear about that at the date, because it's generally a dated document, which this was down here, that you just go back to it and revise it, because these are often written over a bit of a length of time, hopefully, if you've got time, as things progress. And so you just have to come back and review them and add or subtract what you need to. So this was just, this method statement has been completed with access to basic artwork information only. So weights, dimensions of elements are estimates and will be checked when on site prior to handling or once installed. And we had a separate document about the elements and their dimensions, which here was just linked to that document so people could go and have a look at it. It specifies the amount of technicians. You get a lot on individual artwork method statements. So here it was, we'll have 4 people working on the install at all times. Most elements will require 2 people to lift or move. There was this particular person will lead the install of the scenes, which are made up of wooden, MDF, etc. platforms with smaller subsidiary plinths and real furniture. The scenes will be installed first according to the order in this document, with the ceramics added after. So essentially you need to just spell out like what's happening, who's in charge, what are you working with, and how you're going to go about it, essentially. But at this time, when this was written, we weren't actually sure, and neither was the artist. So and then it just says things like, we'll be checking back with the installation manager to consult with the rest of the team as well, to check that things were structurally sound, because we didn't know if they were going to be. But again, it's just being really clear that there's some things unknown and it's something that you're going to check on. But here, they often have information about, you'll get it quite a lot on some method statements, that they'll have information about the packaging, because especially if it's a multi-piece artwork, they can often be in different types of packaging and lots of different containers. And And so often you'll get lots of information, and when this was this was done, that we were awaiting information on what was going to what we were getting, which then turned out to be a huge long list that got inserted into this document once it was finished. This was the overall plan of the install. So again, any sort of plans, photographs, anything is really helpful. This is great from SketchUp. I had to go through and put all the measurements in because they hadn't done them, but it just gave us a really good overview of exactly what was going to happen in the space. And you instantly see that and go, oh, that's quite a bit. And this was just the structures. Then it was ceramics and things all over these structures. And then it just detailed each scene, because each one of these was a scene. And then it details what the ceramics were going to be, which at that time we didn't have a huge amount of information. But in the end, it ended up being loads and loads of stuff that got added to this document. It was quite a huge document at the end. But it just tells you about the plinth itself and how it's going to be made, and the sequence of events. Also really helpful to have the dimensions, because sometimes it might not be the person that is the most familiar with the work that's done the method statement, potentially. So putting in these things, the person who's done the method statement isn't always the person that's going to be there installing it. And so it's really important to have dimensions of things, just so you can be 100% sure that that's the right thing going in the right place. Also, listing materials is really important, especially in this case, because they wanted to use some flammable stuff. And so we had to keep trying to get them to put it in the method statement, because essentially we had to say, if it's not in the method statement, we won't be doing it, and things like that. Then also it was broken into the other task, which was adding all the ceramic elements, which was handled by another person. This was one person did the base and all this stuff, and then another person, the artist and another person were putting all the ceramics on, and it just goes through how that should be done. Oops. Okay, any questions around that before we go into install guides?
Sarah, Harjeet.
Hi, Harjeet.
Hiya. I suppose I'm thinking it's not actually 9 pages long, because you've got a lot of images in there. And I'm just wondering, perhaps that's easier to follow.
Images are often much easier to follow, and they will, but it's just a shame that all the method statements I had were for things where it wasn't a completely finished work, and they were being seen, shown for the very first time. So I'm really sorry about that. I thought I had more complete like works that had been installed and were able to be documented whilst being installed. So you can, if you're doing a method statement, put those in definitely, because photos are so much easier to follow.
Yeah.
But it's also about the method statement being, because you are referring back to your RAMS, you're expanding on what your RAMS are. It's also about, because it's used as a legal document as well, about being a reference for someone to be like, oh, okay, because even if you've got the photos, you're going to have to document how many people are necessary, what equipment you need, and your actual plan of working. Yes, you can definitely do that with photographs, but you still need to actually detail it, unfortunately, in writing.
Yeah.
And yes, you can document on your photos. Definitely, that's really helpful. You get that a lot in install guides, but you tend to with method statements, because they are generally done for very difficult, like quite complex things, that they generally haven't been done previously, or you're often I've had to do them when people are a bit unsure about how we're going to do it. And so it's a way of showing them as well as doing all the legal tick boxes.
Yes, it becomes a multifunctional document.
Yeah, absolutely. And because I've definitely used method statements before for once something has been installed multiple times and it becomes essentially an install guide. But unfortunately I don't have access to any of them. I left them all at my previous work.
Yeah, I've not come. Yeah, I suppose sometimes it's, I think what I find tricky is keeping things separate. So we have a schedule.
Yeah.
And we have the risk assessment. And then we
you have schedule, risk assessment. They're definitely very separate. Method statements, it's just about making sure if something is, I mean, like if it's a 2D artwork, you're generally not going to need a method statement for that. It's when things get a little bit trickier, especially if they have to be, especially if you're using equipment that you've had to list in your risk assessment, like big equipment, like scissor lifts or forklifts and things like that, or even like if there's something where people are going to be working off ladders in particular. People, they love ladders. Method statements for anything that's got it, you've got to use a ladder, just because it's about, you've got to think about it as covering all the bases to make sure as an employer you're covered, as a worker, all this sort of stuff like that. Everybody is really aware of the health and safety whilst you're doing a particular job. Yeah, but I mean 2D stuff, it's pretty straightforward really. And what I've found is in most organizations, they will have like generic risk assessments for installing 2D works and 3D works, that it's just like across the board. Oh, and AV as well. And that's the easiest way to work, just so you're especially if you're in a managerial role or you're running an organization, it's a really good idea just to have those kind of stock standards that you can just refer back to anytime. And I know a very large gallery I used to work for, they would just reassess it every year and just update the date on it and just say that it was a rolling thing for a year. Yeah. That like just
quite handy, actually. Yeah. Okay. That sounds really handy. You just annually review them, but have a stock ready.
But you need to say, you have to be explicit on it that, you know, that this is for basic operation, that it is a rolling risk assessment, that it will be reassessed annually.
Yeah.
So you just need to be explicit about that stuff.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you.
That's okay. Right, any other questions?
Thanks for that, Sarah, and thanks, Haji. Again, please do continue to voice any questions or pop any in the chat as we go along. Just shout up, because Sarah might not necessarily be able to see you on the screen, and I can obviously see. I can't see people's physical hands, but I think if someone raises a Zoom hand, it will pop to the top. But I can certainly see the chat and read anything out. So, okay,
super. Right, let's crack on with, what are we doing? Installation guides. So installation guide is the idea here behind installing artwork is that we are displaying artworks in the manner in which the artist intended them to be represented, or if it's an object, how it was intended to be, you know, well, not always used, that's not true, but you know, how conservators say we should display things. And so we're trying to do all of that, though, without drawing attention to the manner in which it's installed. So a good installation guide should be a written description accompanied by photographs, which when handed to a professional art technician, they will know exactly what to do to make the artwork look the way an artist intended it to be represented within a space. So the most important information that we want to cover is the medium, the dimensions, and that includes like the number of parts and the dimensions if they're relevant, of course, Any spatial requirements, what should the space the work is installed in look like, and the size required. For example, it should be installed from a wall or a ceiling surface. It needs to fit within a space that is, I don't know, 2 meters squared, which is actually quite massive. And considerations such as it needs to be installed over a corner. Preferred hanging heights, if there is a specific height for installation or a plan of measurements of placement of elements. So say if it's a multi-component artwork, that there you can provide things like templates, which are really awesome and make life so much easier for tricksy things. Weight, even a guess of a weight is helpful, but it should definitely state that it's an estimate. Any handling instructions, so where we can handle it if there are delicate areas, if it's very fragile, etc. And photos. To be honest, the photos are the really, really important bit of an artwork object installed, and also deinstalled before assembly. So like a documentation essentially of all the parts, so you can have an actual inventory of what it's made up of. If you do nothing else, this is the most important thing you can provide. So medium. Art materials and methods of making can be anything an artist or maker uses to create any art. Oh my goodness, sorry, tripping over my words. In any combination. Materials and methods also can be defined as the process of manufacturing of fabrication or fabrication of a piece of art, such as bronze that needs to be melted down and poured into a mold. So we're not talking about necessarily the finish of an artwork when we say medium, so like whether it's smooth or rough. The medium is what is the work physically made of. It's a summation of what an artwork object is comprised of. And why do we need to know this? Because then we know what we are working with and we can plan accordingly, such as know the correct materials we can use when packing your work, what we need for installation in terms of equipment and installation materials and people and all sorts. So mediums inform our handling considerations. That's the main reason we need to know about it. For example, charcoal on paper, if it's charcoal on paper, it's unglazed and it's unframed artwork. We need to know that, because we might need to do things like discuss how fixatives, or we can discuss framing options. And then if they don't want to do either of those things, use fixatives or framing, then we've got to discuss what the installation options are, and that if they want to pin it to the wall, that then it's making holes in the paper, which cannot be removed, and things like that. It helps us know that we will need a lot of gloves and to handle it in a certain way, and that we will need to take certain precautions, such as have a clean, flat surface for the work to be on, that we can't put it face down because the charcoal will rub off, that we need to think about packaging potentially and things like that. Even though it is an install guide, it does kind of, packaging sometimes can pop into the install guide. Medium. So this is a good example that why medium is important, because when you look at this work by Jeff Koons, it looks really light. It looks like it's just full of air, and that it's, you assume, if you didn't know, of course, it was a Jeff Koons, that it was just a blow-up toy, but in fact, it's cast from metal and then painted to look like plastic vinyl. They are incredibly heavy. And they have a cold, hard surface. So instantly, because we know what the medium is, which is polychromed aluminum or aluminium and rubber coated steel, that we can already surmise that it's going to be pretty heavy, and that we're going to potentially need quite a few people to be able to handle that and move it. Dimensions. So why do we need to know the dimensions? Because then we know what we're working with to the millimeter. Measuring accurately is incredibly important. It tells us the size of what we're working with, because photographs can be deceiving. We can make sure it can fit in the building, that we can get through doorways and lifts, things like that. We can find the correct space to install the artwork in. It lets us know if potentially we need to source elements or get the correct size of parts, etc. And sometimes it might mean that we've got to make packaging for it, such as fabricating a crate. We also require the measurements of art once it's packaged too, so we can arrange transport and to know if we need additional equipment, etc. So what you'll normally do with install instructions, they generally, you generally get them from galleries, from artists, from studios. Fabricators don't tend to do them, although occasionally, if it's incredibly difficult, it will generally come down to the whoever's handling the artwork first from a fabricator, that they would generally have to write them a lot. In my role at a commercial gallery, because we had lots of new artworks that came in, also some old, and we would have to write them for anybody that was handling them afterwards, because they were generally quite tricky. But this is the dimensions of this artwork were just listed as 470 by 1945 by 1100 millimeters. So that instantly tells me that it doesn't include the chains, because otherwise the height, which is normally height first, is just of the metal art part of the artwork, that the chains have not. It means that we're going to potentially have to find that out if it's not in the install guide, but it lets us know. This is another one that I initially got this artwork come in that it was just the hair that I was giving the dimensions of, but it turned out that actually the hair, because this necklace is made, the beads are made out of hair, that actually the beads on this wooden bust were actually part of the artwork. So this was the whole artwork. It wasn't just the hair necklace. So we had to go in and change it, and also update the install instructions that this was the entire work. It wasn't just the hair, because they were also packed separately and had come from different places. So we weren't sure. So we had to go back to the artist and check. But that's something that why the medium is really important, but also why the dimensions, because the dimensions of just this were much smaller and also very different. So when we see it with these dimensions, we can assume that this is the whole work. You always have to double check, but okay. This was a really basic install guide that I was given by somebody, and it had no photos. And they've got some good stuff, information here. So name of the artwork and the date, that it was ceramics that on a table. All that stuff was great. And then it goes through to describe the 2 low-rise plinths may need to be touched up after being transported. Paint will be provided, which is very nice because it was a very specific type of paint that we couldn't source immediately. So that was great. They will be pushed together and taped down the middle and then painted to create the illusion of one large seamless plinth. The large porcelain figures will be perched upon accompanying plaster cylinder plinths. The smaller porcelain figurines and ceramic tentacles will be placed upon the low-rise grey plinths. The figures close to the edge can be fixed down with museum wax. Scatterings of clay debris will be sprinkled over the installation. Now, this work was actually a lot more complex than that, and it was made up of something like 150 individual pieces of like the figurines and tentacles and stuff. And go back to the artist and say, look, you need to provide us with proper documentation. We need like any photos you've got. You need to also tell us, we need to see where they sit on the plinth. The information about the plinth, that was really straightforward, but the actual placing of the figures and just the ceramic elements was really it was quite tricky, and we didn't really know what was happening, and there was nails that were sticking up from the plinth, which you had to actually put some of the works, support the works on, so they were sticking straight up. So yeah, it was just one of those things that, yes, the information about the plinths was really helpful, but we needed photo documentation to really help us. And it didn't need a lot of information, to be honest. Like, it didn't need all this information about the figurines. It's good basic stuff, but it was good that they told us we could fix things down with museum wax, because the institution that the work had been lent to were concerned about some of the objects being stolen. So it was good we knew we could use museum wax, but we didn't know what the work was supposed to look like. So we went back to the artists, they sent us a load of photos, and it looked really nice. This is a install guide of an artwork from an American artist, Christopher Myers, which comes with certain items. So it tells you what you need to buy. So essentially this is, and it tells you where to get it from, but unfortunately we don't have Home Depot in the UK. But it tells you what you need, and it's really important to have measurements and things like that of exactly what sort of tubing, so that at least I can look it up on the Home Depot website, and then I can work out what potentially is an equivalent in the UK. Unfortunately, these things didn't seem to exist in the UK. We have slightly different ones. But essentially this was all the things that we knew that we needed to purchase to be able to install the artworks. Oopsie. And then it shows you, it tells you how to hang a particular size quilt, because these install instructions were just a generic install instruction that they sent with every work of Christopher's, wherever they traveled around the world, and then you just had to work it out based on this information that you've got, regardless of what size of quilt you had. So it tells you what you need from all this stuff up here, and then it shows you how you put the rods together, and then tells you how to put some duct tape around it in places. And then essentially you feed the rod through loops like they show here, which are on the artwork. And then you just had these hooks in the wall which the rod itself sat on. It didn't have a lot of information about how far the rod should sit. Well, it didn't have any information actually of how far the rod should sit out. Whoopsie. Once it was fed through the hook. So we just made a decision based on the information we had, and looking at some images online of how they'd been installed previously. So although this information is really good, it would be nice if it had been a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit more tailored to a specific artwork, but still it was really helpful. And even little diagrams like this, even if it's hand drawn, can be incredibly helpful. Another install guide, which is a Darren Ormond. It gives you all the information, but it tells you that that this is the installed dimensions. These are the dimensions when essentially all the panels are together, which is not particularly helpful. But here it does tell you the inventory of what you should have when the work arrives with you, that there are 42 split battens which are attached to the back of the work for 42 panels, and each panel are these sizes. Tells you how many technicians you need for install, which is 2. It also tells you that, so you have the dimensions of each work, but there should be a 20mm gap around each panel. So that was top and bottom. And then it just goes through some information about, like, essentially this was generic about what they put on all installation guides that came out of the White Cube. That essentially it's up to the install team that are working on this particular artwork to make the best decision for the work based on where it's being installed, so the wall it's being installed on, things like that, and that they need to work to local health and safety regulations, but also that the artwork is based on is site specific, site dependent, sorry, and then also that not always fixings and things like that will be added, which this one, it didn't have any screws for the split battens, which often happens. You'll normally need to supply them, but often you'll get it in other install guides. They will tell you if things are packed in with the artwork or what needs to be sourced, like we saw on the other one. So this is essentially, this was what the work looks like when it's installed. So that's always really helpful to have an overall image of the entire work as it should appear when it's installed appropriately, and the way that the artist wants it installed. But also this was a plan. Essentially what we did was we labeled each panel. We went A to G down the left and then 1 to 6. So this was A1, panel A1, this was D4, because as you can see, some of these are blank, and so we weren't sure exactly what went where. It's fine when you've got these, you can often work it out based on what's on the face of the work, but with these we couldn't, so they all had to actually be labeled on the back. And so providing this gives the key to the people that are installing it to make it a bit easier for them. And then this was essentially the measurements, that then given these measurements, you shouldn't need to measure where the batten sits on the back of the work, things like that. But essentially you can look to this and put all these measurements in and put all the battens up, and it should be correct. Often you'll get things like that if it's something that's awkward and it's kind of, I should have put an example in there. Actually, I completely forgot, although I don't think I've got one, where it's something that's quite difficult and it's got lots of elements and it's irregularly shaped, then you can do a template just by getting some polythene. So you obviously, the first time it's installed, it's all measured out and it's marked up on the wall, but then when it's taken down, then you can make a template of where all the screws sit or all the fixings, and so then that's all done on polythene, a sheet of nice thick polythene that then can travel with the artwork and be part of the installation guide as well. And that's it. Any comments, Phil? That stuff I didn't cover?
It's instructions for installation are incredibly important, and really important that you follow them and you trust that the people you're working with follows them. We have had a number of occasions where people have been hurt or become rather unwell. There was an install team in Germany earlier this year who was putting a artwork up that had formaldehyde included in it, and they trusted that their tech manager, the person running the job, had read the instructions and followed them, and he turned up with just some dust masks, and everyone installing the piece got incredibly unwell, and the piece hadn't they couldn't install the piece because it was making people sick. So regardless of the safety to the artwork, these instructions are quite often written with you, the technician, in mind as well. And also when you do get presented with instructions, it is important to read them rather than just sort of follow the images, because the images won't be able to tell you how much something weighs or whether it's fragile or anything like that.
Yeah, because I didn't, it's a shame really, I didn't have any install guides that had anything about handling in them, because they were all big buffy things. But you often get it. I know there's one particular artist, a ceramicist, who you can only hold their artworks in very specific places. And so they're generally in the install guide and also in the method statement when they're done for hers, but not always, because they don't do method statements a lot for hers, even though they should. But it will tell you like specific places, like and the underside body sections are the strongest places to place your hands. Make sure you examine the work really, really closely before you do any handling, and make sure that you can identify some places that it can be safely held. You also sometimes in an install guide actually get a photograph, which they will have actually detailed, like only hold here, here, and here. It cannot be touched anywhere else, which is really, really helpful. Yeah. Any questions?
Did you, sorry, it's me again. Did you produce a method statement for the castle as well when we had that 1 week?
No, not a method statement, because we weren't doing a specific tricky thing, but I did produce the RAMS, which did they get? I think they got sent around, didn't they?
I don't remember having seen them before.
I definitely printed them out, and we definitely, because we didn't cover it. Normally we do cover it a little bit more in the core training, but because we were doing this session, we didn't cover it quite as much. But yeah, my bad. We should have emailed them round to you. That's what I normally do. But we did have one on site.
Yeah, they were carried out by Sarah and approved by the castle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because when we're installing our exhibitions at the museum, we tend to have a few days and usually something quite simpler, not always, sometimes a lot simpler. So then what we have is it looks a lot like the risk assessment, which has lots of different things in it, and then the method statement also has lots of different things in it, and it's not as specific as some of the examples that you're showing us.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if you had an example of a method statement which is a little more generic rather than specific to an artwork, because we might have something complex like that, but we've also got about 14, 15 other things in the gallery as well. And I think certainly for me, I understand the risk assessments, but sometimes I feel I don't know, sometimes I feel that we're not quite there with our method statement. And I'm just wondering whether there's an ideal one that you could share. Sorry, I did miss the first 15 minutes of the session, which didn't help.
That's okay. I don't have like a template, and because it's generally been based on, when I've had to do method statements, it's generally been based on how the format which I've been asked to complete it by a specific organization. I don't have any that's like a general kind of template, but I'm sure I can find some somewhere. But also I can just do you one up. It would be helpful to have, but because I know what's supposed to be in them. I've done all this training, and I have to do them all the time. But yeah, definitely different organizations ask for different things. But in general, as a general rule, it is just it's essentially, I always think a method statement is like an install guide and RAMS smushed together. But you're not being as explicit about tripping and those sorts of hazards, but it's about trying to be as comprehensive as possible, a method statement about covering that legal risk assessment element, but also being a practical guide for install, and also as a method statement I generally think of as like, it's kind of incorporating your schedule as well, like you said, like it's like it's about thinking about, like, first we're going to do this and then we're going to do this. It's not necessarily like a timed thing, although I have had it on method statements where I've had to say, document like how long I think each part of the work would take. Just because it was based around trying to fit in with times the institution was closed and things like that. Yeah, I mean, Haji,
I guess I'll just use this to jump in as an opportunity to mention something that I think works really well and feels relevant to this, I guess, from your position, Harjeet, more within an organization, is like sharing of resources in terms of training opportunities, because I feel like this would be something that obviously in this context we're thinking about how it's valuable to technicians, and that's both within organizations and institutions who are, you know, on the payroll, but also freelancers, but thinking about how this would be useful to organizations. So I had risk assessment training a long time ago now, and it's certainly something that I would appreciate a refresh on. And quite often, as you know, organizations have very stretched budgets, and there are smaller organizations working on even smaller budgets. So something that we've started to do in the other organization that I work for, and that I've seen other organizations doing too, is putting on a training opportunity, such as, you know, maybe working with someone like Sarah or somebody who would be willing to come in and do, let's say, you know, a full day version of this in person in an organization, but having that organization you know, cover the bulk of the cost or offer to share out the cost, and inviting other organizations in. So the other organization I work at in Nottingham, when we did first aid training recently, we invited the trainer into primary. We paid the bulk of their fee, and then we invited other members of staff from other organisations in Nottingham to join that session and to pay a small fee to engage in that training. And I've recently benefited from another instance of that with another organisation in the Midlands, looking at neurodiversity within the arts training. And I think that this feels like something that would be super beneficial, and something that I'm happy to chat with you about, Haji, if you think it's something that could be beneficial to other organisations in, you know, Leicester, Leicestershire and the East Midlands, for example, as kind of maybe doing something that's more thorough and looks at sharing of resources such as templates and best practice within organisations.
Yeah, because we work with freelance technicians. Sometimes we ask them to put RAMS together. Sometimes we work with artists and curators, and they also share their RAMS with us, and they just feel like everybody seems to struggle with a method statement. So that just seems to be a thing across the board.
No, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, it's not something I'm, you know, super familiar with. I don't really work so much on installs now, but yes, risk assessments, but method statements, not so much.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We've got a question from Lachlan. Hi, just wondering, for digital work / video works with specific software written by the artists, is the install guide also similar? If I remember right, Lachlan's microphone doesn't work. So maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Lachlan, please do speak up if your mic does work. But is this about thinking about installing AV work and method statements for installing AV work?
Yeah, you definitely need them. It's the same as in particular, like digital video works and stuff, like with the amount of equipment you need, and a lot of the time institutions won't actually have that, so they might need to source it, or the artist might need to source it and things like that. So that's really important in terms of having an install guide. But
I mean, I've been involved before in like a really complex install, and this wasn't actually digital, but it was something where we had a conservation expert get involved, because it was a massive installation piece that involved like weighing out sand and referring to pictures, and yeah, very similar to what you've been showing us, but yeah, very elaborate. And that was a piece that was in a collection, and they had those instructions, I guess, as part of the collecting and the keeping safe and the redisplay of that work. Like you say, it's the same for any artwork, isn't it? Digital,
it's the same. It doesn't matter what
painting it directly onto the wall. Performance as well, there are directions around how a work will be performed, which an artist will have agreed with the collector.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's any art form, to be honest. And probably especially with anything kind of live with real people in it, you're going to definitely need some method statements, because there's a lot that can go wrong there. But Phil, you're AV.
I've done a little bit of AV, yeah. And I think if an artist or a gallery sends you a complicated artwork without a install guide, and if you're not able to create a method statement around that install guide, then the artists in the gallery should prepare to be phoned up quite a lot, because you will need to communicate to them to find out what exactly it is their needs are. If it's not a simple case of plugging a media player into a monitor, then you are going to have to go back and speak to the artist and things like that. I mean, I've done installs where I've had incredibly complicated install guides and method statements prepared for us, but then the person hasn't necessarily seen the space the artwork has gone into properly, and we've had to really make it up as we go along, because a SketchUp drawing of something that's handmade rarely actually captures the object and its nature. But sorry, to get back to AV stuff, yeah, you want as much information from the artist or from the gallery or from the lender as you can, and again, hopefully you'll have some contact information to get in touch with them and find out what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why, especially like commercial galleries, they love install guides, because essentially what they want to do is make it as easy as possible for themselves and the artists, that essentially as soon as the install guide's created with, it gets packed in with the artwork, wherever it goes, someone will send a digital copy as well. And so that essentially then the gallery can go, right, you guys go for it now. You've got all the information. So they were generally pretty detailed and wanted to, because it can be really, it's quite time consuming having lots of questions coming back and forth all the time. And so it's good to kind of think about it as a way to try and cut down your workload, especially if you're writing the install guides. But also just to make life easier for everybody, because it takes a lot of back and forth asking questions about how something's installed or how it's supposed to look, or all sorts of bits and pieces about it. Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with different time zones.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, be prepared. Yeah. Preparation is key, and so is communication. But like you say, better to have that communication early on, and then you're kind of hopefully ready for anything or almost anything. Thank you for your question, Lachlan. Has anyone else got any thoughts or questions around anything that's been covered so far by Sarah in the session this evening? Nothing at the minute. I'll chat for a bit to fill a void in case there are any questions, and if not, we can begin to wrap things up unless there's anything else that Sarah or Phil wants to contribute. Again, another really useful session. So I
mean, the method statement for me, I find incredibly helpful just to work through my process of how I'm going to do things. It means generally I am incredibly prepared for what I need to do. That's, if you're writing them, that's really helpful, but also like it's really nice to get install guides before you're going on a job to really get an idea of what you've got to do, and also like the tools that you've got to bring to a job, and just so you can be as prepared as possible, not just mentally but also in terms of sometimes it's your clothes that you might need, something grubby that you want to wear your rough clothes. It's about having the right tools if you need to supply your tools. I find them incredibly helpful, and I actually quite like writing them, but that's because I'm a nerd. Yeah.
Remember though, it is always just a guide, and if an artwork has been touring around the world and it requires a specific fixture or fitting, and it should arrive with that fixture or fitting, it's not a guarantee that it will. So you do have to adapt, and you do have to work with contingency measures as well, which is you know, why there's training and why technicians with a lot of experience are often quite desirable. Aren't we lucky?
Yeah, technicians are certainly brilliant at thinking on their feet and responding to a situation. And I think that's a really good example of that. Great. Okay, well, if there's nothing else from anyone in the space, I will thank Sarah from ArtTechSpace for today's brilliant presentation, again, which will be shared along with the recording. And thank you, Phil, also for your contributions. Thank you, everyone who's attended, and thank you, Lachlan and Harjeet, for your questions and thoughts today as well. That was really useful to have some points to talk through. So great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to see you all again.